On her wedding day, she stood in front of 1,000 guests, smiling, radiant, believing she had the world in her hands. But inside her heart, a storm was already raging. He, humble, overweight, barely known outside his small town, smiled back at her as if everything was perfect. And none of them had any idea how cruel this day really was. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. She was born into comfort, the kind of life where everything seemed easy and within reach. Her parents gave her the best schools, the best clothes, and the kind of freedom most people could only dream of. Friends surrounded her, not always because they cared deeply about her, but because being in her circle meant status. She was admired, envied, and even whispered about in her town. Wherever she walked, people noticed. But admiration often comes with pressure, and for her, the pressure came from those very friends who cheered her on. They had a strange way of showing affection, testing her, daring her, pushing her to prove herself over and over again. One night, in laughter and arrogance, they gave her a challenge, one that seemed harmless at first. "Marry him," they said with smirks on their faces. "Make it a bet. Prove that you could take the poorest, most unlikely man and make him yours." He was nothing like the men in her world. He worked long hours at a small repair shop, hands often stained with grease and sweat. His body was large, heavy-set, something people joked about behind his back. His clothes rarely fit him well, and his shoes were worn from years of use. For as long as he could remember, he had been the subject of ridicule. The rich mocked his poverty, children teased his weight, and even in moments of kindness, he often wondered if people truly saw him or only pitied him. Yet he carried a heart bigger than his frame, full of patience, full of hope. He dreamed, quietly, of finding someone who could see past the surface, who could recognize the man he truly was. When their worlds collided, it was not by accident, but by design. She walked into his life like a queen stepping into a humble home. At first, he could not believe she noticed him. Her smile, her soft words, her sudden attention, it all felt like a miracle he never asked for but desperately needed. For him, it was a chance to finally belong, to finally matter. For her, it was just the beginning of a game. What her friends didn't realize was that the bet they planted in jest would grow into something much larger than any of them had planned. Because love, whether real or faked, has a way of pulling people into places they never expected to be. And what started as laughter among friends was about to turn into a story that none of them could control. Would you have taken that bet if it were you? Or would you have walked away before crossing a line that could destroy lives? She began her performance carefully, almost like an actress rehearsing lines for the role of a lifetime. At first, it was small gestures, asking how his day was, smiling when he spoke, touching his arm in ways that made him feel seen for the very first time. To him, it was overwhelming. Here was a woman who seemed so far above his world, yet she was leaning in, listening to his stories, laughing at his jokes, even ones he thought were silly. He found himself waking up each morning with a new purpose, eager to see her face, eager to hear her voice. For years he had lived in the shadows of ridicule and invisibility, but now it felt as though the sun had chosen to shine just for him. His co-workers noticed the change, how he hummed at work, how he saved every extra penny to buy her small gifts, how he carried himself with pride instead of shame. She, on the other hand, wore her mask well. Each compliment she gave him, each laugh, each tender glance, it was all part of the act. Behind closed doors, she told her friends every detail, and together they laughed until tears rolled down their cheeks. To them, this was pure entertainment. They would mimic his walk, his laugh, the way he blushed when she touched his hand. They called it their little secret, a story they would someday brag about when they were older, saying, "Remember when she actually married him for fun?" What they didn't realize was that with every cruel chuckle, every whisper of mockery. They were weaving a trap that would eventually catch them all. For him, though, those days felt like paradise. He began writing in a notebook again, something he hadn't done since high school. Scribbles about love, about her, about how grateful he was that someone had finally chosen him. He wanted to believe that life was changing, that fate had finally decided to reward him after years of loneliness. And in a way, that belief made him stronger, kinder, and even more determined to give her the life she deserved. He introduced her to his family, who welcomed her warmly, unable to hide their happiness that he had found someone. They saw the glow on his face, the way he carried himself with pride, and for the first time, they believed he was truly happy. But happiness built on lies has cracks that eventually show. There were moments when her eyes gave her away, moments when the softness in her voice slipped into impatience, moments when the warmth in her touch cooled into indifference. He ignored them at first, choosing instead to believe in the dream. Because sometimes, when you've been starved of love for too long, you cling to even the illusion of it. But while he believed her smile, behind closed doors, she laughed with her friends, and what she didn't know was that the man she mocked was about to teach her the hardest lesson of her life. Have you ever trusted someone so completely, only to find out that their love was a mask? How would you feel if the person you thought was your blessing turned out to be part of a cruel game? The wedding preparations began like a dream, or at least that's how he saw it. For him, every small step toward that day was proof that his life was finally changing. He walked into flower shops he never thought he'd afford, carefully picking out bouquets with trembling hands, imagining her smile when he brought them to her. He worked extra shifts, saving every coin, skipping meals just so he could surprise her with little gifts, a necklace here, a dress there. His co-workers would ask him why he looked so tired, and he'd grin, saying, "It's worth it. She's worth everything." To his family, he was a man transformed. He brought her home for dinners, beaming with pride as he introduced her. They saw how he looked at her, like she was the answer to every prayer he had ever whispered into the dark. His mother wiped tears from her eyes, whispering that she had never seen her son so happy. His siblings teased him gently, but inside they were relieved. After years of watching him suffer in silence, they believed he had finally found his match. But while he floated in this fragile bubble of happiness, she was living another life entirely. With him, she played the perfect fiancée, laughing at his jokes, leaning into his arm, pretending to adore every small surprise he gave her. Yet, when the door closed and the night settled, her mask came off. She met her friends in hushed gatherings, mocking the way he looked in his suit, the way he stumbled nervously when trying to impress her parents, the way he spoke with such innocent pride about their future together. They called it their little comedy show, and every detail she shared became another punchline. Still, he never saw the cracks, or maybe he chose not to. Love has a strange way of blinding us, of making us rewrite reality into something gentler, softer than it really is. When she looked distracted, he told himself she was tired. When she sneered under her breath, he convinced himself he had misunderstood. When her friends whispered and giggled as he walked by, he silenced the knot in his stomach with hope. He wanted so badly to believe that she loved him, that she had chosen him, that finally, someone had seen him as enough. The closer the wedding came, the deeper he sank into the illusion. He stood in front of the mirror at night, practicing vows with a smile on his face, unaware that the stage he was preparing for was built on lies. And though the world around him glittered with the promise of love, those cracks, hidden beneath laughter and secrets, were already beginning to spread. Every step closer to the wedding pulled him deeper into the illusion, but cracks were already forming. And the question lingers, how long can a mask be worn before it slips? Would she be able to keep up the charade forever, or was the truth waiting to explode at the altar? A week before the wedding, the secret that had been whispered behind closed doors finally slipped into the open. In the glow of a late-night party, surrounded by her closest friends, the bride-to-be laughed a little too loudly, spoke a little too freely, and let her pride run wild. She bragged about the bet, how her friends had dared her, how she had chosen him because he was the perfect target, how easy it had been to make him fall head over heels. She spoke as though it were nothing more than a game, as though the heart she was toying with was disposable. Every detail poured out like poison, and the room filled with laughter that cut through the night like broken glass. But what she didn't realize was that someone else was listening. A cousin of the groom, standing near the door, froze as the truth washed over him. His chest tightened, his fists curled, and anger surged through him, not just at her, but at the cruelty of all who encouraged it. He left that party with a single thought burning in his mind. The groom had to know. The man who had sacrificed so much, who had given everything he had for her, couldn't walk into that church blind. When he told the groom, the silence was deafening. For a moment, the groom just stared at him, as if the words couldn't be real. But instead of exploding in rage or breaking down in tears, a strange calm settled over him. His lips curved into a faint smile, one that his cousin couldn't understand. He nodded slowly, thanked him for telling the truth, and promised he'd take care of it. But he never spoke another word about it. From that day forward, he continued as if nothing had happened. He bought the final touches for the wedding, rehearsed his vows, and looked at her with the same loving eyes as before. To everyone else, it seemed like nothing had changed. But inside, a quiet storm was brewing. He had made a decision, one that no one could see, one that left his cousin unsettled every time he caught that calm, knowing smile. Why didn't he stop the wedding? Why didn't he walk away from the humiliation that awaited him? What was he planning behind that silence, behind that smile? If you're still here watching, drop a comment saying, "I'm still here." Let's see who's really paying attention. The wedding day arrived with all the beauty and splendor one could imagine. The church was dressed in flowers, ribbons, and music that floated softly through the air. Guests whispered in excitement, fanning themselves against the warm light streaming through the stained glass windows. To them, it was the perfect day, the kind of scene people dream of, the kind of love story they believed in. But behind the veil of perfection, the truth was pressing closer, threatening to shatter everything. The bride stood at the altar, radiant in her gown, a smile painted carefully across her face. Yet beneath that polished surface, nerves rippled through her body. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the bouquet, her eyes darting every so often toward the pews where her friends sat, stifling their laughter. To her, this was still the game, the bet, the performance she had promised to complete. And yet, for reasons she couldn't name, something about this moment felt heavier, harder to laugh at. The groom, however, was different. Gone was the nervous, stumbling man who second-guessed every word and every step. As he stood at the altar, his shoulders squared and his eyes steady, there was a calmness about him that no one expected. He smiled, but it wasn't the naive grin of a man lost in blind love. It was deeper, quieter, as though he knew something no one else did. Guests began to notice. Murmurs spread quietly across the pews. Why was he so composed, so strangely confident, on a day that should have overwhelmed him? The vows began. She spoke first, her voice sweet and measured, her words rehearsed to perfection. She talked of love, of promises, of forever, but inside, she was simply going through the motions. The audience beamed, wiping away tears, believing every word. She glanced at him with a smile that was meant to look adoring, but her heart was already elsewhere. Then came his turn. The groom took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the church, meeting the eyes of his family, his friends, and finally resting on hers. His lips parted, and for the briefest of moments, time seemed to hold still. Everyone leaned forward, waiting for the words of a man in love. But what no one knew was that he had prepared a surprise of his own, and when he finally spoke, the entire church fell silent. The groom's voice carried through the church, steady and unshaken. At first he spoke like every other groom, words of love, gratitude, and devotion. People leaned back in their seats, smiling softly, expecting a tender declaration. But then his tone shifted. Calm, deliberate, cutting through the air like a blade. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded envelope, his hands firm, his eyes unflinching. "I was told," he began, "that love was supposed to be the greatest gift a person could receive, that it was rare, sacred, and worth giving everything for. I believed that with my whole heart. But what I didn't know was that for some people, love is nothing more than a game." The church fell silent. A murmur rippled through the crowd as he unfolded the papers, printed screenshots, messages exchanged between the bride and her friends. Laughter captured in text form, cruel words, the details of a bet that turned his heart into entertainment. Then came the recording. A voice note played from his phone, echoing through the high ceiling of the church. Her laughter, her mocking words, the dare she had accepted. The walls of the sanctuary shook with the weight of the truth. Gasps erupted from every corner. Some guests covered their mouths, others stared wide-eyed, and a few turned toward the bride's friends, who quickly dropped their gazes, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The bride's smile collapsed. Her skin flushed pale beneath the heavy veil of makeup, and her hands began to tremble so violently that the bouquet nearly slipped from her grip. Then he spoke again, his voice stronger now, filled not with anger but with clarity. "I knew all along. Every word, every lie, every whisper behind my back, I heard it. I saw it. And I stayed silent, not because I was weak, but because I wanted the truth to be seen. Not by me alone, but by the world that believed this was love." The bride's knees buckled. Tears streamed down her face as the room closed in around her. The weight of humiliation pressed harder than the heaviest gown. The audience that once admired her beauty now stared at her with pity, with judgment, with disbelief. She had come to the altar to laugh at him, to humiliate him quietly, but in a cruel twist of fate, it was she who stood exposed, stripped of her dignity before everyone she had sought to impress. And in that moment, the story turned. The poor, overweight man she thought would be the butt of the joke had become the hero, the man who stood tall, unbroken, speaking truth with dignity and strength. And she, the radiant bride, became the betrayer, the fool, the one who played herself in front of the very audience she once sought to entertain. The church was silent, as if the very walls themselves were listening. And as she collapsed into sobs, it became clear that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence in the church was unbearable, stretching longer with every heartbeat. The bride, once the center of admiration, now stood in ruins. Her mascara streaked, her veil heavy with tears, her body trembling beneath the weight of shame. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of whether to pity her or despise her. Her friends avoided her eyes, their smirks long gone, replaced with fear of being pulled into the collapse of her pride. And then, without another word, the groom turned, calm, dignified. With the same steady steps that had carried him through life's ridicule, he walked down the aisle. No rush, no hesitation, no need to look back. Every step was a declaration that his worth had never been defined by her approval, nor by the cruel laughter of those who mocked him. He walked out of the church with nothing in his hands, but everything in his heart, his dignity, his truth, and the respect of every single soul who had witnessed what just happened. Behind him, she fell to her knees, clutching her dress, her cries echoing against the stone walls. The very people she wanted to impress turned away in silence. And in that moment, the lesson became painfully clear. Wealth can buy admiration, beauty can capture attention, but only character earns respect. The poor, overweight man she thought was beneath her walked away as the true victor. Because sometimes the ones we dismiss, the ones we think are unworthy, are the very people who show us what strength, integrity, and self-respect really look like. And sometimes the cruelest games we play end up teaching us the hardest truths. So let me ask you, What do you think? If this story hit you like it did us, hit that like button. It helps us reach more people. And subscribe if you want more gripping stories every single week. And tell us in the comments, do you think he was right to expose her at the altar, or should he have walked away quietly?